For all in attendance, I would note that today's meeting is being live streamed on the ncpc.gov website. We do have a quorum, so we will call the meeting to order, and we, without objection, will proceed along lines of the agenda that has been publicly noticed. Agenda item number 1 is the report of the chairman, and I have nothing of significance to report. Agenda item number 2 is report of the executive director, Mr. Acosta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start off by welcoming 2 new members to our staff. First, we have Michael Bello. Michael. He joins our physical planning division. He is an urban designer who worked with the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission and also at Gensler prior to joining NCPC. Michael holds a Master in Architecture and Urban Design from Columbia University and a Bachelor in Landscape Architecture from the University of Florida. Second, we have John Gerbich. John joined the Urban Design and Plan Review Division. He recently worked for the National Park Service at their Denver Service Center. Thank you, Peter. And John has a master's in urban and regional planning from the University of Colorado at Denver and a degree in journalism from the Ohio State University. As you'll recall, last year's update to the comprehensive plan included an action plan identifying implementation projects. The action plan proposed a short-term project to complete a study to thoroughly assess our current parking ratios. I'm pleased to announce that we're kicking off this study with the U.S. Department of Transportation Volpe Research Center, and I've asked Cale Anderson of our staff to provide a brief overview. Cale?
As a central planning agency for the federal government, NCPC is charged with planning for the development of federal properties in the District of Columbia and environs. NCPC's primary assessment tool for reviewing proposals is the comprehensive plan. The plan's transportation element includes several sets of policies related to transportation demand management, transit, bicycling, shuttles, and other components. One specific set are policies related to parking and parking ratios. The policies establish employee parking ratio goals based on transit availability and proximity to downtown DC. The ratios allocate 1 employee space per a numeric range of employees, ranging from 5 employees for locations within the central employment area to 1.5 employees for suburban locations not proximate to Metro Rail service or high occupancy vehicle facilities. This parking study will assess NCPC's current parking ratio goals for application to federal development in light of regional policies, planning standards, and best practices. To conduct the study, staff engaged the Volpe National Transportation Systems Center. Volpe is a research center within the U.S. Department of Transportation. We prepared our 2003 tour bus study, and the Park Service also contracts with Volpe on an as-needed basis for transportation projects. The study has 3 main tasks. Volpe will conduct a literature review identifying best practices for parking policies in different built environments with varying degrees of transit accessibility and different federal facility types. The parking standard comparison is an analysis to compare parking standards, parking guidelines, and how that compares to existing mode splits for representative federal facilities. A transportation model analysis will assess approaches to estimate future year mode split and parking demand. Using data from the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, this analysis will examine NCPC's ratios with expected changes in regional land use patterns, including changes to federal facilities, worker demographics, and the transportation system through the year 2030. Recognizing that parking ratio standards are important, standards with which we use to review projects, the schedule is arranged such that the study will be complete by this summer. Volpe will present a draft report in the spring, of which the Commission will have an opportunity to review. The study will conclude with a final report by early summer. And as far as next steps, we anticipate the report will inform future transportation and facility planning, and depending upon the recommendations, we may accelerate an update of the transportation element of the comprehensive plan.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Very good. Given the importance and the frequency of parking ratios that come up in discussion, this is no small matter, so we're grateful that it's being undertaken. Any questions for Mr. Anderson? Hearing none, thank you very much. Mr. Costa, you have further items? Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Costa on anything else? Hearing none. Agenda item number 3 is the legislative update. General Counsel, Ms. Schuyler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Happy New Year to all of our commissioners. The 115th Congress kicked off on the 3rd of this month, and on the very first day, 2 resolutions were introduced respectively in the House and the Senate that affect your business. Essentially, the resolutions address the issue of allowing a commemorative work, a memorial for the Desert Storm, Desert Shield operations in Area 1. And the House proceeded to waive its rules yesterday, and although it had been referred to committee, took an action and approved it. So there's only action required on the part of the Senate to render this effective. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions on this for Ms. Schuyler? Agenda item number 4 is the consent calendar. We have 5 items. Agenda item 4A is for preliminary site and building plans for the new Orr Elementary School in Southeast Washington, D.C. It's brought to us by the Department of General Services. Agenda item 4B is for preliminary and final site development plans for a multi-use trail rehab and pedestrian bridge in Rock Creek Park. That is brought to us by the National Park Service. Agenda item 4C is for the preliminary and final site and building plans for the Bancroft Elementary School modernization in Northwest D.C. That also is brought to us by GSA. Agenda item 4D is the preliminary and final building plans to install a rooftop antenna on Building 196 at the Washington Navy Yard, submitted by the Department of the Navy. And agenda item 4E is for comments on the preliminary and final site and building plans to install ground-mounted photovoltaic panels at Joint Base Anacostia Bowling in Southeast, submitted by the Department of the Navy. Any questions on any of those 5 consent calendar items? Mr. May.
I have no comments on the antenna installation.
New Year's resolution.
It's a new year.
I have a quick,
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the Rock Creek multi-use trail, I just want to say how exciting it is to see that those improvements are being planned. I did have a question about the tree, any kind of tree disturbance and how that's being handled as part of the planning and execution process.
Ms. Lee, welcome.
So I understand there was a tree protection drawing in the construction documents, and they plan to provide more trees to replace the trees that will be impacted. But in the pedestrian bridge portion, they are saving, I think, a couple of specimen trees, and that's why the alignment, they consider the specimen trees on the alignment.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions or comments? Thank you, Ms. Lee. Is there a motion on the 5 consent calendar items? It's been moved and seconded. All in favor of the consent calendar say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Carries unanimously. Agenda item 5A is a substantial item. It's the final square guidelines for squares 378 and 379, which are the current site of the FBI headquarters and the J. Edgar Hoover building, which will be transmitted to the Department of the General Services Administration. By way of background, the Commission approved preliminary square guidelines and released them for public comment at our meeting on October the 6th. Since that time, since October, NCPC has worked with GSA and the District of Columbia and the Commission of Fine Arts and the National Park Service and other stakeholders to address a few outstanding issues. Those discussions have been successful, and we believe outstanding issues have been successfully addressed. I want to acknowledge and express appreciation for the ongoing work of all of these stakeholders, and the guidelines before you do reflect a shared understanding of how we can meet the dual goals of maximizing the site's development potential, which is important, while also ensuring that we protect and enhance Pennsylvania Avenue's civic character, role, and function, and the very important public space. We also appreciate the significant public interest and comments that we have received during the development and consideration of the square guidelines. It has been a group effort in the broadest sense. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Ms. Miller to present.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, members of the commission. The final guidelines for squares 378 and 379, the site of the J. Edgar Hoover Building, is before you today for approval and transmittal to GSA. And I just want to reiterate some of the chairman's remarks, and that it's really been a pleasure to work on these guidelines. Our team has appreciated the ability to help, with the help of others, to shape the guidance and help coordinate both local and federal interests that align both the economic and the civic framework for this very important redevelopment opportunity on the Avenue. And I would just reiterate the appreciation to all the stakeholders, particularly GSA, the district, and CFA, and the Park Service, as well as the public, for their participation and guidance. It's no question that there have been many objectives and opinions to balance through this process, and we appreciate the range of perspectives and believe that the actual guidelines are a better result because of that. So GSA is scheduled to select their exchange partner in March to develop a new headquarters for the FBI. The new site will be located outside the district, and as we know, will be developed partly in exchange for the fee simple title to the J. Edgar Hoover building and land. And just as a reminder, Square 378 sits to the north, and Square 379 fronts Pennsylvania Avenue to the south. And together, this 6.5-acre site lies within the area governed by the 1974 Pennsylvania Avenue Plan. And it's also included in the Pennsylvania Avenue Initiative, which I will talk about a little bit more in a few minutes. I've broken what I promised to be a short presentation today into two parts. I will review the Commission's action on the preliminary guidelines and highlight key issues that, as Chairman remarked, we believe we've resolved. And then I will overview the substantive revisions to the proposed final guidelines. At preliminary approval, the Commission approved the Executive Director's recommended square guidelines and directed release of these guidelines for a 30-day public comment period. And those comments are provided in the packet at your dais. Overall, the guidelines address important land use and urban design issues that will both protect and enhance the Avenue's civic function and character, which is a national priority, and is equally important, strengthen the economic vitality and support the Avenue's role as a premier destination in Washington, D.C. The guidelines achieve this by allowing a high-density mixed-use development up to a height of 160 feet on Square 378, and this is unique to any other area in the district, except for the area within the Pennsylvania Avenue planning area. The guidelines will also maintain and protect the public realm, provide guidance regarding circulation, and I would like to emphasize, encourage contemporary urban design practices that will respect the context of this historic neighborhood and district. To recap some of the decisions and issues, the Commission approved the reinstatement of D Street in its original L'Enfant Plan configuration and the building envelope guidelines for Square 378. So on Square 378, the initial height of development is set at 110 feet as measured from the highest elevation of E Street, with an upper story setback of 1:1 to a maximum height of 160 as measured from Pennsylvania Avenue. And I just would like to point out that due to the approximate 16-foot elevation change north and south across the site, the initial building heights on other corners will range between 117 and 120 feet. For Square 379, the Commission approved a build-to line that sits a minimum 30 feet from the property line or the historic L'Enfant right-of-way and considers the unobstructive view cone that we've discussed in the past. So these together create an initial height of development that is set at 110 feet fronting Pennsylvania Avenue. The initial height will be 120 on D Street, which actually mirrors the building to the north on Square 378. The upper story setbacks for this square are 1:1 up to a maximum height of 135 feet. And I would like to note that reducing the build-to line from 50 to 35 feet will require a future land transfer from the National Park Service to the General Services Administration for private development purposes. This will be subject to future review and approval by this commission. At the October meeting, the commission heard a range of opinions among the commissioners as well as the public about the location of Pennsylvania Avenue's Bill-2 line. Opinions range from keeping the line in its current location, moving it to the historic L'Enfant right-of-way, or something in between. This range of options is based on several competing objectives, as such honoring the principles of L'Enfant Plan, maximizing economic potential, to protecting the the vista, and also the public space to retain the character and function of the avenue. Recognizing that we can't make a decision on an unknown future condition, the commission approved the 30-foot Bill-2 line, which balances all of these objectives. Acknowledging that the traffic conditions have changed, the commission also included a flexible provision in the recommended guidelines to allow for a Bill-2 line to move closer to or at the property line if the public space can support this function. The plan is amended and updated, and of course, funding is secured to implement these changes. What's important is if we think about moving the Bill-2 line back to L'Enfant right-of-way, we need to think about this in context of the entire avenue. Over the past couple of months, NCPC, GSA, and the district have met and discussed our mutual desire to improve the economic vitality and the physical conditions along the avenue. And we agree that the reallocation of the cartway and sidewalks should be studied to see if it's desirable and feasible. The square guidelines is really a microcosm of the larger discussion that we need to have about Pennsylvania Avenue. I'm pleased to let you know that the Pennsylvania Avenue Initiative is underway, and we are assessing how to better balance stronger economic vitality with improved physical conditions. The initiative's executive committee is currently undertaking the foundational work that will include assessing this cartway and sidewalk reallocation, which again may also affect the future Bill-2 lines. 3 studies are in various stages of progress. A high-level market study was recently completed. We are currently working on and wrapping up the urban design analysis, and DDOT recently initiated a transportation study to specifically look at the traffic and pedestrian capacity, and that is expected to be complete in the fall. These initial studies will help us identify near and long-term strategies to improve the economic and physical conditions, and we should be in a good place to provide you with the commission and the public with an update and a more detailed briefing on our work in late spring or early summer. And we are working actively with the executive committee. Okay, so with the context of what I've just reviewed with you, I would like to now focus on the final guidelines. So as I mentioned, during our discussions with the district and GSA, the district has stressed the importance of evaluating the feasibility of returning to the urban design principles of the L'Enfant Plan, including reducing or reallocating the space within the cartway and sidewalk. The district also requests that we add a new provision requiring a zoning commission review. So the proposed final square guidelines that are listed here, at least the topics are listed here, are substantially the same as what the commission approved in October. There have been some minor revisions and 2 substantive changes that I will review with you. The minor revisions were made to improve clarity, organization, and grammar, correct omissions and errors, address consistency issues, and reduce redundancy. In the packet that we delivered to you on December 29th, I outlined 8 minor revisions that while they were not substantive changes, they do read differently than the preliminary guidelines. So therefore, I felt it was important to point that out. Since we delivered that packet to you, we've also identified a few more minor revisions. We've updated the relevant pages of the EDR and have placed at your dais. And these are highlighted in yellow. You'll see that they're relatively few and minor. I have reviewed these changes with GSA and have received their concurrence that they are appropriate and acceptable. The 2 substantive changes are additions. The first addresses zoning commission design review as requested by the district. Section B of the guidelines, which addresses the regulatory system, has been amended to require zoning commission design review for future site development proposals. The District of Columbia zoning regulations, subtitle I, section 7, already includes provisions for zoning commission design review and approval of similar projects such as North Capitol Street and Independence Avenue. And this design review is relatively narrow in that it will address site planning, architectural and landscape design, and vista protection to ensure that local planning objectives are achieved. And we all believe that this is important given the size and location of this site. The second substantive change is a new general stormwater provision. Section E15 has been revised to add a provision that the developer should work closely with the regulatory agencies in designing the stormwater system for the site. Before I conclude with the Executive Director's recommendation, I just wanted to update you on a number of other related activities that are underway. GSA's programmatic agreement was signed on November 18th. It lays out the process for the 106 consultation for the consolidation and exchange transaction, including the SQUARE guidelines before you today. And that is actually shown here in this, I don't know if you can see. You can see where the PA has been executed. GSA is also on schedule to release the final environmental impact statement in March for public comment. And I'm happy to say we're here before you for the commission meeting, and as I mentioned, we will also be coming back to you late spring, early summer to update you on the Pennsylvania Avenue Initiative. This concludes my presentation. I'm pleased to present the Executive Director's that the Executive Director recommends that the Commission approve and transmit the guidelines for Squares 378 and 379 in accordance with 40 U.S.C. 6702 and the 1996 Memorandum of Agreement, with two notes. One about the two substantive revisions made since the guidelines were approved in October, the preliminary guidelines were approved in October, and another note that summarizes the minor revisions. That concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. We do have two folks signed up to speak. The first is Aaron Hassinger with GSA. Welcome back.
Try this again with this mic. Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, first of all, Happy New Year. 2016 was quite a year. I'm sure 2017 will be just as eventful. Thank you for the opportunity to present today on behalf of the General Services Administration. GSA would like to thank NCPC and the stakeholder agencies for their participation and hard work in reaching this important milestone for the SQUARE guidelines at the J. Edgar Hoover building site. They're a product of much debate, negotiation, and ultimately compromise. And while opinions still vary regarding historic preservation, monetary value, future development potential, and how each is affected by and expressed within the guidelines, I think there's broad agreement that the completion marks an important step forward. We look forward to an expeditious review as the SQUARE guidelines move through the 106 process that GSA will initiate soon. GSA would also like to recognize and thank stakeholders for the tremendous effort that went into the creation of the recently signed programmatic agreement for the FBI program. Over the last 18 months, GSA is proud to have led a collaborative effort facilitating numerous consulting party meetings, multiple revisions, and navigating complicated processes to develop a programmatic agreement we believe provides a guiding document for future work. The FBI headquarters consolidation project is an important project for GSA, the FBI, the region, and the American people. We appreciate NCPC's perspective and look forward to continued collaboration as the new home of the FBI and the redevelopment of the JH site progress. Mr. Chairman, again, thank you for the opportunity to speak, and best wishes to the Commission in the new year.
Thank you very much. Any questions for Mr. Hassinger? The second person is Joanne Newhouse, representing the Penn Quarter Neighborhood Association. Yeah. You have 5 minutes. Welcome back. It's nice to see you again.
That's why I said I won't finish if I don't
That's
start
right.
right there.
Yep.
Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission, my name is Joanne Newhouse, and I'm representing the Penn Quarter Neighborhood Association. I need to add, as most of you know, but some of you may not, that I worked at the Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation for 20 years and actually had some input in some of the guidelines, the SQUARE guidelines. So I have a history of knowing what this is all about. I'd like to cover 4 topics today. 1, the retention of the third row of trees on Pennsylvania Avenue. 2, the square guidelines must require uses that have not been developed without first being required. 3, our city may not have sufficient density to have lovely open spaces and alleys that will move people off sidewalks. And 4, it is critical that the square guidelines or some provision be made that legal documents specify items on which different parcel owners must cooperate if the site is subdivided. I'm not sure that has to be in the square guidelines, but it needs your attention. Another thing that needs your attention is that the pavers on Pennsylvania Avenue be saved during demolition and construction because they are not being made anymore. So I'm just putting that out for future. I realize the commission will not require a 50-foot setback, and that is short-sighted in my view, in our view. The additional row of trees on the north side of the avenue creates a far more pleasant pedestrian environment than do the 2 rows of trees on the south side of the sidewalk. And I think anyone who walks there can see that. It is hard to imagine that anyone concerned with the urban environment would reject an additional row of trees. As I said previously, there are a number of boring sidewalks nearby, and they are all far narrower than Pennsylvania Avenue. The sidewalk's width is not why the FBI block is lifeless. Equating the depth of the sidewalk with animation is a red herring. Further, 3 times in the past, the commission supported the 50-foot sidewalk depth, and I regret that this commission will not support retention of the 3 rows of trees. Hopefully, the National Park Service will see there is wisdom in retaining the landscape treatment of the avenue. Second, the square guidelines the Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation prepared included requirements for uses that were less remunerative than offices. They required development of a minimum number of residential units on several blocks. They required cultural uses such as theaters and art galleries, and in some cases they required that only retail and restaurants could locate on the ground floor along specific streets or park frontages. When there were development competitions, prospectuses often increased these requirements or gave preferences to proposals that exceeded the requirements. In these square guidelines, there are no, and this happened under GSA as well. In these square guidelines, there are no such requirements, only recommendations that such uses be included. Without question, had residential units not been required either by the Pennsylvania Avenue Plan, the square guidelines, a development prospectus, or a zoning overlay, none of the residential units we have today would have been built at Market Square North, at the Landsberg, the Pennsylvania, the Clara Barton, the Lafayette, Historic Row, Terrell Place, Mather Studios, Gallery Place, or the Museum. Because these square guidelines do not require residential development, it is more likely than not that unless some outside force places unusual pressure on the developer, or there are financial incentives to build residences on the site, as the city provided on the sites north and east of Chinatown, along Mass Avenue and at City Center, D.C., the chances that residences will be developed on the FBI site, a high-density commercial site, is somewhere between nil and practically nil if past is prologue. Similarly, arts and cultural facilities that have to find another home, unless, like Mrs. Kafert's, the developer has a special dedication to the arts and deep pockets, it won't happen. That is something any public body may wish for, but would it not be irresponsible to act on such a wish? Retail and restaurant venues may continue to seek spaces that rent for considerably less than retail space in Pence Quarter. Just look at this building. There are no ground floor retail or restaurant tenants, and in some spaces it has been years since they were occupied. If retail isn't required, you may end up with ground floor offices that have long leases. So much for animating the sidewalks. Be careful about wanting active open space, interior walkways, and other elements that will take people off sidewalks if you want to animate existing public spaces. We do not have the population density of Fifth Avenue in Manhattan or the Champs-Élysées in Paris. It is rare that the sidewalks here are filled with pedestrians. Think how they would be if people could walk elsewhere. You can just look at 8th Street by the City Center, D.C., relatively empty. Then look at Palmer Alley, which parallels 8th Street. Here people are strolling even after shops close. Think about the repercussions of such lovely, privately maintained walkways and adjoining open spaces before seeking them. You may want both, but we may not have the foot traffic for both to be animated. And now, since there's insufficient time, I'll stop. Should I stop or just? Okay. I said there was insufficient time for me to explain that it would be nice to designate minimum development parcels, but it is critical to establish a list of items where separate owners are required to cooperate if the site is subdivided. Legal agreements are usually required to ensure this. I'm not sure that should be in the square guidelines, but I said I think it needs to be addressed. It can't just be sloughed off. And those agreements could be done privately between the developers, but it's something that there should be some oversight of. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
No, thank you very much. We're glad you came back. We will now return the proceedings to the commission for discussion or motions.
Move the vote on the EDR.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. Are there further comments or discussions? Mr. May?
Well, I'll say something.
Sure.
No, and I won't say much. I really do appreciate all the work that has been done since our last meeting to get to this agreement. It's always good to get to consensus, and in this case in particular, since it's such an important project as it comes before this commission, so I would commend the staff and the GSA and the District of Columbia representatives for all their work in getting us here. And we played a supporting role, but I think the heavy lifting since last time was all in the hands of those three. So I really do appreciate it, and I'm glad to be here today and not have to have a lot of discussion then. So, enough.
Mr. Cash?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to, as my boss, Chairman Mendelson's been pretty vocal about the wider sidewalks. I know he's supportive of this proposal. He really appreciates the work that's gone on. He appreciates staff and you, Mr. Chairman, reaching out to us to discuss the proposals. He did point out, and I was reminded walking over here today, looking at the inaugural viewing stands that are being set up and noticing how much more you can get in those wider sidewalks versus right next to the Wilson Building. You have one little row, and then you have a lot more space in the other areas. But I think it does show the importance of the open public space, but he is nonetheless very appreciative of the work that went into this and is happy with the result.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I just want to echo all the accolades to everyone. It was a lot of hard work on a lot of staffs and a lot of meetings. I think this also highlights the need to do a lot of thinking on the Pennsylvania Avenue initiative, just in terms of the public realm, in terms of the Cartway. I know we all had wished we had that initiative first, and we went here, but as Ms. Miller had said, this is the predecessor to sort of lay out some of that thinking. So I think as we think about just economic development, activation of public realm, rethinking the street, that when that comes to us, we should be just as strong in our opinions and just as diligent in collaboration on that initiative as well. But just once again, I'm really happy for us to have gotten to where we had to on these guidelines. And I'm excited about getting it done, about getting something built there. So GSA, let's get on that.
Mr. Acosta?
Yeah, I'd just like to say a few thank yous. First of all to GSA, Mr. Hassinger, and also Nia Francis, who was served as the project manager for this. Very much enjoyed working with them, and thank them for the good work on this. Also to our colleagues at the Office of Planning, thank you for your very good comments regarding urban design, and also we agree with you in terms of this is a early discussion, one that we need to have regarding the future of Pennsylvania Avenue, and it's one of our most important streets. And this will be one of the most important projects that we'll see probably in our lifetime with respect to Pennsylvania Avenue. So we need to do this right, and we appreciate all the comments that we received from our stakeholders, but also from the public at large. So thank you very much. And also to the staff, Ms. Miller, Diane Sullivan, who've done a lot of work on this project. Thank you for your good work on this.
So the other mayoral appointees are absent today, and that has nothing to do with this. We've all been briefed and shared the same commitment and excitement about these going through. So I know that Mr. Dixon and Mr. Griffith said to make sure that I shared that publicly while they're not here.
Sure. Thank you very much for that. Mr. Gallus?
What's that about who doth protest too loudly? No, just kidding. I'm really impressed and pleased with the way this all came together. It's fascinating to me how all the forces found the center of the argument and came out with what I think is a very, very positive result. I reread the whole package again. I'm still a rookie and I like that stuff. And in particular, Kingdon Gould's comments are one I just want to read a short excerpt of. He said, "The avenue belongs to our whole country. Is there a more stirring sight than the sun on the Capitol dome at the end of Pennsylvania Avenue? Have you seen the moon rise over the Capitol? This broad, generous avenue is an invaluable symbol of our democracy." And I think that the work that we do here, even though it's a piece of this much bigger picture, really, I just want to commend everyone and say how pleased I am to be part of this. I like the two enhancements that were made. I think having the District Zoning Commission having a role in this gives me comfort, actually, in a positive way. So, and then, of course, stormwater management is always a concern in everything we do. So congratulations and thank you all.
Thank you. Ms. White?
I just want to echo all of these eloquent comments and say what a nice way to start off the new year, having reached this compromise. And I'm really struck by Director Acosta's comment that this will have such impact, and probably the most in our lifetime, in terms of how Pennsylvania Avenue will be impacted. And so I compliment you and the rest of the team for working through these issues. It's really quite an accomplishment. Thank you.
Further accolades?
Bringing up the rear. I would say all of that too, but a couple of add-ons. I really hope this isn't the most important thing we do in our lifetime, or that we get done on Pennsylvania Avenue. I'm really hopeful that the initiative brings more than just ideas and brings action, and that we can all, having gotten over this hump, we can move on to the next one, which is really thrilling and possibly could be implemented before I croak, and that would be lovely. Beth, you deserve, I don't know, a vacation. Because I know you spent a lot of long nights, and on behalf of GSA, I would like to thank you personally. Happy New Year.
I just want to thank the NCPC team, because that's where the hard work occurs. So I just want to give my accolades to our team.
Since seeing no further discussion, is there a motion on and the question before us is on to be certain, the question before us is on the approval of the final square guidelines for transmittal to GSA. Since no further discussion, is there a motion on the EDR as amended? Oh, it's already been moved. I'm sorry, I failed. Okay, all in favor of the EDR say aye. Aye. All opposed to the EDR say no. Are there any abstentions? There's one abstention. So thank you very much. Agenda item 5B is the approval of the final master plan for Fort Belvoir. Also a significant item before us. I will note that reaching this point has taken a lot of effort. As we know that Belvoir is experiencing tremendous growth and will likely continue expanding. So having a good comprehensive master plan is quite important. And Mr. Weil, thank you for
Absolutely.
all of your work.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. So this is a final master plan approval for Fort Belvoir, which is located in southeastern Fairfax County, Virginia. The submission includes 3 key documents: the installation vision and development plan, which is the master plan, the transportation management plan, and the installation planning standards document. So as a bit of background, the current master plan exists from 1993. The Army was in the process of updating the master plan in the early 2000s when Congress passed a Base Realignment and Closure Act in 2005. So the Army had to shift gears to plan for an influx of development over the next few years after that. As an interim step, they revised their land use plan to accommodate the new wave of development that was approaching Fort Belvoir at that time. After the wave passed, the Army reinitiated the master plan update process again in about 2011 or 2012. They submitted the draft master plan for NCPC review back in 2014, and now it's back for final review this year. So as part of the master plan submission, I'd like to, basically the purpose of the submission is to highlight several noteworthy aspects of the master plan submission, to review the Commission's 2014 comments and how the Army addresses those comments through the final submission, and also to help familiarize the Commission with the final master plan, since this will be a key a preliminary planning tool by which the Commission will review future development at Fort Belvoir. So some noteworthy strategies included in the master plan submission. The master plan document itself includes a fairly detailed site assessment where there's about 15 different natural, environmental, historic, and man-made constraints identified across the installation. And then those constraints are combined through a composite graphic to identify where the best locations for sustainable development in the future across the installation. The submission includes a comprehensive installation planning standards document, pretty comprehensive travel demand management program, which is based on a computer traffic model assessment, basically forecasting traffic impacts from the installation through 2030. The submission does incorporate, it includes, it looks at climate change through a projection forecasting the potential sea level rise and river level rise in the adjacent Potomac River to try to see what parts of the installation are impacted. And then that's rolled into a future site analysis and helping to determine where future projects should be located. And the master plan document also has a number of identified environmental mitigation areas that are potential sites for future off-site environmental improvements. So a little information about the existing installation. It currently encompasses 8,500 acres, accommodates approximately 40,000 employees. It's home to over 140 Department of Defense organizations and home to approximately 7,500 residents. So this essentially is a relatively small city in Virginia. The main post is divided into 4 functional areas. The North Post, shown in yellow, South Post, Davison Army Airfield, and the Southwest area. The Southwest area is largely undeveloped. A majority of the post's development resides on South Post and spreads a little bit into the southern portion of the North Post. And then there's a kind of a satellite campus known as the Fort Belvoir North area on the other side of I-95. So here's the existing land use plan and a satellite photo of the installation. As you can note, a majority of the development resides along an elevated plateau area, primarily encompassed by the South Post, but again, it spreads across Route 1 into the North Post. So the Commission has a pretty long history of reviewing sizable projects on the installation. I'd just like to note that all of these projects are existing. The one project that's a future project that has not opened yet is the new Museum of the Army. The Commission gave final approval on this project back in 2012. I believe the construction is just starting on this project, and it's scheduled to open, I believe, in 2020. So the master plan assumptions are based on an assumed 16,000 employee increase, which would increase the employment population on the post to 56,000. The master plan is divided into two time frames, a short-term time frame, which started in 2020 or 2012 when the master planning process was initiated, extending out to this year, and then there's a long-term component that covers 2018 to 2030. So the final master plan document itself is divided into 5 chapters. The first chapter is a description of the visioning exercise the post went through to develop a vision statement and a number of guiding planning principles shown in the table below. The second chapter, as I previously mentioned, this documents in pretty great detail the site assessment process that was used to help identify the most preferred development sites for future projects on Fort Belvoir. And then this is the composite graphic that was produced from layering all those constraints on top of one another. So the most suitable property for development is shown in the darkish brown area. The least suitable is, or the property with the most amount of constraints is shown in the light yellow. The third chapter covers the future land use plan for the installation. There were 4 key changes from the existing land use plan shown by the numbers. And basically what the Army is doing is they are converting property which is currently classified for community and industrial uses over to professional and institutional uses to help continue the transformation of the installation from a training and engineering proving ground to a more institutional installation. The fourth chapter is the framework plan. So this basically translates the guiding planning principles that were created and developed as part of the visioning chapter 1 into planning strategies that are intended to design to help guide the longer land use patterns throughout the installation. Like, for example, one of the planning strategies is to concentrate development, further concentrated along the roughly north-south elevated plateau area across the south and the north post. And then the Army created a more detailed development centers plan based on that larger scale, more abstract planning strategy. And this shows a number of identified areas for densification across the installation over the next few decades. Another strategy is to establish a network of transit zones throughout the installation to create a more sustainable travel environment. And then again, that was translated into a more detailed multimodal circulation plan that includes a number of transit hubs, an internal transit system, and a pretty good network of hiker-biker trails and bicycle lanes. And then basically the land use, the site assessment, and these framework plan strategies were superimposed upon one another and used to develop a future development parcels graphic. And this shows potential development sites throughout the installation with the land use, with the proposed future land use classification superimposed each of the future development sites. And the final chapter covers infrastructure. So based on a needs assessment and analysis across the installation and the prior planning work, the master plan includes recommended transportation improvements, recommended watershed improvements to help improve the natural environment across the installation, and also a number of improvements that will help improve the water distribution and sewer systems to help keep up with the projected 16,000 employee population growth. So back in 2014, the Commission had a number of comments on the draft master plan at the time. The Commission supported the vision and guiding principles of the master plan documents. However, the Commission requested that the Army evaluate environmental mitigation areas, which it has, and includes this graphic in their final master plan. And this shows a pretty wide range of mitigation areas in the future, which will help improve the streams on the installation, tree replacement areas, and also wildlife refuge areas in the future. And these sites are used to basically as off-site project mitigation areas if a project cannot fully mitigate its environmental impacts. These are kind of mitigation sheds, so to speak, where potential future mitigation can be located. Related to the Commission's request to investigate potential sea level rise and its effect on development, the Army did that by basically increasing the Potomac River in the stream levels by 10 feet, which is reflective of the 100-year flood event, and then an additional 6 feet on top of that, which is the recommended projected potential gradual increase in river level for the Mid-Atlantic area. And so the Army took that analysis and modified its future recommended development sites accordingly.
That's the projected increase over what period of time?
For the, I believe it's 100 years, but I can't remember whether it's 100 or 150 years, so. And the last thing the Commission recommended were they wanted to see potential sustainable energy sites, so potential future sites throughout the installation where the Army could locate potential solar arrays, wind generation, and geothermal generation. This graphic is not to Fort Belvoir. This is an example graphic that I included from a different master plan at the Naval Research Laboratory. The Army reviewed that request and determined that it was not feasible for them to do under the scope of work of this master plan. However, they are planning to look at that information on a project-by-project basis. I'd also like to point out that they are currently undertaking a study to figure out how to implement the Department of Defense's future energy sustainability goals throughout the installation at this point. But that was not included as part of the master planning process. So staff, you'll see that in the very final slide at the end of the presentation, we are recommending that the Commission recommend future project submissions include this information on a project-by-project basis related to, looking at sustainable energy sources and their applicability to future projects. Related to the Transportation Management Plan, back in 2014, the Commission had a number of comments, and what I'll do is I'll run through the Transportation Management Plan document, and then pursuant to that description, I'll go point by point and describe how the Army has addressed each of these points. So this is a list of the chapters in the Transportation Management Plan. As you can see, it's fairly comprehensive. Just to orient the Commission, Fort Belvoir is located several miles south of the southernmost Metro Rail station at Franconia Springfield. It's also located several miles away from the closest VRE station. So there is no direct regional transit access to the installation at this point. And this has resulted in a single occupant vehicle mode share of 81%. The current final TMP and master plan have adopted a pretty ambitious goal of reducing that SOV mode share down to 60% by 2030. The Army plans on doing this through several different strategies, and I'll highlight three in the presentation. The first is by having a very stringent parking management program whereby they have very detailed parking inventories on a building-by-building basis. The Army has a parking cap on administrative employee uses that allows no more than 60% of parking spaces for employees compared to a particular building project's population. So for example, if a building has 100 people, the Army employee parking cap for that administrative use allows no more than 60 spaces for that 100 employee population. The Army has also adopted an employee parking cap for other types of employee parking at using the NCPC parking ratio goal of 1 to 1.5. As you can see in the graphic, the Army has conducted a fairly detailed analysis showing where excess employee parking is currently located, shown by the red and the yellow shaded sub-districts. And then the Army will try to encourage development in these areas, and development that is to be located in these areas will be encouraged to look at basically using existing parking and shared parking opportunities to help balance out those parking ratios and help the Army reach their goal of 60%. The second key strategy is really to build up the transit, biking, and pedestrian infrastructure, as shown by the Multimodal Circulation Network Plan. And also I'd like to point out that the graphic on the left shows a historic railway right-of-way that the Army is holding for a potential future transit facility extension from the VRE railway right-of-way down into the heart of the installation. And assuming that Fort Belvoir is successful in extending that, a transit facility into the installation, that will really help the Army reach that 60% SOV mode share goal. And lastly, they have a pretty robust menu of transportation management programs. I know the Department of Public Works really sits down with each of the existing tenants and future potential tenants to try to figure out how to come up with a tailored transportation management plan at the tenant level to help comply with that 60% mode share goal. So again, and there are a lot of other strategies in the TMP. Their long-term 2030 mode share goal is 60%. So referring back to the 2014 Commission comment requesting that the Army continue to evaluate strategies and opportunities to reach NCPC's applicable 1 to 1.5 parking ratio goal, staff felt it appropriate that in the final recommendation, the Commission note that the TMP does include a long-term 1 to 1.5 parking ratio goal and a single occupant vehicle mode share goal of 60%. Related to the first set of requests, these relate to the master plan's EIS and record of decision. The final two requests basically reference post-mitigation monitoring within the TMP and a commitment to do it in conjunction with Fairfax County. The Army has agreed to monitor the TMP through its ROD and also really work closely with VDOT and Fairfax County to monitor how the TMP is doing. The very first mitigation, the very first request was asking the Army to fund specific mitigation programs and include those programs in the record of decision. In place of that, the Army included a list of strategies and thresholds in which it would again monitor the success of the TMP, and they included this menu of strategies in the ROD in place of those specific funded programs. Regarding the second list of requests that reference the TMP, the first request asked for a mechanism for monitoring individual agency TMPs. The TMP includes a pretty detailed chapter, the final chapter on monitoring and evaluation, and it does relate to individual agency TMPs. The Commission requested that the Army develop strategies that target basically visitor travel down to Fort Belvoir, and there are several strategies that do relate to visitor travel. And lastly, the Commission requested that the Army institute a district-level parking ratios within the South Post development, and they have not only done an analysis, but they do have ratios that specifically are tied to each of these parking districts. Regarding the third and final master planning document, which includes all the installation planning standards. Basically, back in 2014, the Commission recommended that the Army evaluate low-impact development standards related to roadways and parking areas, and also permeable pavement standards. And the Army, so basically, I'll go ahead and I'll describe the planning document, and then I'll tell you how they addressed that. Basically, the installation parking standards divides the installation up into 20 smaller design districts. Each of these design districts has a regulating plan and a set of material standards associated with each of the districts to try to create individual and unique districts. The installation planning standards document also includes a pretty detailed chapters related to streetscape design, landscape standards and planning, and also includes a pretty good inventory of specific element design standards as well. And it's a pretty comprehensive document. And the Army does incorporate some low-impact development standards related to roadways and parking areas, and also permeable pavement standards in 2 of its chapters, which are included in the installation planning standards document. So back in 2014, the Commission comments were divided into 5 basic categories. I've covered the master plan, the TMP, and the installation planning standard related comments, and I'll now cover the last 2 categories. The 4th category relates to the Potomac Heritage National Scenic Trail. This is a trail that runs from southwestern Pennsylvania along the C&O Canal Trail, past Fort Belvoir into the northern neck of Virginia and southern Maryland. And at that time, there were 4 notes that basically noted the history of the trail and NCPC's planning related to Fort Belvoir and the trail alignment. And the one note that is really germane to the final review of the master plan notes that the Army, the National Park Service, Northern Virginia Regional Commission, and NCPC are in the process of executing a memorandum of understanding which outlines a feasibility study to plan for how the Potomac Heritage Trail will cross Fort Belvoir. And actually, the final information presentation following this presentation will talk about the NCPC, the ongoing NCPC feasibility study. Staff felt it appropriate to update the note to note that the Potomac Heritage Trail is shown as a tentative alignment in the master plan based on the Fairfax County Comprehensive Plan, that the NCPC feasibility study, which you'll hear about next, may propose a modified trail alignment, and that the Army will use the study findings to inform the next Fort Belvoir master plan update, which is currently scheduled for only a couple of years from now in 2019. And finally, related to the comment, basically the Commission requested that the Army work with the National Park Service, NCPC, VDOT, and Fairfax County to address all of the staff level comments. And the Army has successfully done that by submitting a pretty detailed matrix and also adjusting the planning document accordingly. However, staff felt it appropriate to recommend, building on several of the National Park Service's comments, to recommend that the Army explore NPS's comments related to implementing and improving 2 river-based trails that go adjacent to the post. One is known as the Captain John Smith Chesapeake National Historic Trail, and the second is the Star Spangled Banner National Scenic Historic Trail, and to undertake this effort as part of the 2019 Fort Belvoir Master Plan update. And so this is the final Executive Director's recommendation to the Commission to approve the final Fort Belvoir Master Plan for use by the Commission as a guide for future reviews of individual site and building projects. To note that the Potomac Heritage Trail, as shown in the 2015 Fort Belvoir Master Plan, is a tentative alignment based on the Fairfax County Comp Plan, that the current NCPC feasibility study may propose a modified trail alignment, and that the Army will use the feasibility study to inform the next Fort Belvoir Master Plan update. To recommend that the Army include information that details consideration of sustainable energy sources on a project-by-project basis in future submissions. To note that the TMP includes a long-term installation parking ratio goal of 1 to 1.5 and a long-term SOV mode share goal of 60%. And to recommend that the Army further explore the National Park Service's comments related to improvements and implementation of the Captain John Smith Chesapeake National Historic Trail and Star Spangled Banner National Scenic Historic Trail as part of the 2019 Fort Belvoir Master Plan update. That concludes my presentation. I'm available for any questions. And we also have Chris Landgraf here, who is the Deputy Director for the Department of Public Works at Fort Belvoir, who is also available for questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wiles. Obvious that a great deal of work has gone into this, and I'm sure you and Mr. Landgraf are happy to have it completed, at least for now. There's more work to be done. Are there questions for Mr. Weil or comments on the EDR that's before you? Hearing none, is there a motion on the EDR? It's been moved and seconded. Sensing no discussion, all in favor of the EDR as presented, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Thank you very much, Mr. Landgraf. Congratulations. That completes our two agenda items for voting purposes. Our last item before us is the agenda item 6A is an information presentation related to the previous one on the Potomac Heritage National Scenic Trail draft feasibility study, which looks at connecting a gap in the trail through Fort Belvoir. We have Ms. Spigel to present an overview of the study, which NCPC prepared as a deliverable from a partnership between the Army, the National Park Service, and our friends at the Northern Virginia Regional Commission. Ms. Spigel, welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission. I'm here today to update you on the Physical Planning Division's work on the draft feasibility study for the Potomac Heritage National Scenic Trail, or PHT, in the vicinity of Fort Belvoir. The purpose of today's presentation is to inform you on PHT planning work as it relates to your forthcoming review of Fort Belvoir's South Post perimeter fence and future master plan updates. The draft feasibility study area is located at U.S. Army Garrison Fort Belvoir. The PHT alignments currently stop on either side of the Fort Belvoir property line, terminating at Old Colchester Road on the west and at Mount Vernon Highway on the east. Therefore, a gap remains in the trail through Fort Belvoir property. In the past, NCPC reviewed Fort Belvoir's South Post fence in 2011 and master plan in 2014. At that time, an MOU was created among the Army, NCPC, NPS, and NVRC, which established a partnership to consider options for eliminating the gap in the PHT. The purpose of the feasibility study, which is the subject of today's presentation, is to fulfill the terms of the MOU and consider the challenges and opportunities of various trail alignments between Gristmill Park and Pohick Bay Regional Park through Fort Belvoir. The PHT is one of 11 national scenic trails authorized by Congress and designated for trails with particular natural beauty. The PHT is now planned to be over 900 miles in length and connects the mouth of the Potomac River to the Allegheny Plateau in western Pennsylvania. Fort Belvoir is located at the red dot on the map. Development of the PHT network is guided by several pieces of legislation, in particular the National Trail Systems Act, authorized the development of the PHT. The Sykes Act authorizes cooperative agreements between DoD and DOI to encourage natural resource preservation and recreation, including public access where practicable. The Duncan Hunter National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2009 provides authorities and guidance for planning to eliminate the gap at Fort Belvoir. In addition, development of the PHT network is also guided by federal, state, regional, and local plans and studies. The parks and open space and transportation elements of the comprehensive plan provide guidance on trail development, as does the Fairfax County Comprehensive Plan. As Mike mentioned earlier in his presentation, Fort Belvoir's master plan and TMP acknowledge the PHT with a conceptual trail alignment co-located with the Washington Rochambeau Revolutionary Route National Historic Trail and the East Coast Greenway, which is planned to connect Florida to Maine. The master plan references the partnership planning work on the PHT and defers to the current feasibility study process for determining the alignment. Also, in 1997, Fort Belvoir released an environmental assessment which specified a purpose and need statement for the trail and a preferred trail alignment. The 1997 trail, shown in the lower diagram, was planned to be a 10-foot wide multi-purpose trail for walking and bicycling and was set back 30 to 500 feet south of US Route 1. This setback removed the trail from the road far enough for trail users to experience a relatively natural setting. However, in 2012, the Federal Highway Administration began improvements and expansions to a 3.5-mile segment of Route 1 between Telegraph Road and Mount Vernon Memorial Highway. This expanded Route 1 to 6 lanes of traffic with a 32-foot wide center median reserved for future public transit improvements. The current capital improvements affect potential PHT alignments as the expanded roadway curtails the possibility of the 1997 EA alignment to be realized. The lower diagram shows in red 5 locations where the new roadway expansion conflicts with the 1997 trail. The 1997 EA alignment was considered and dismissed from the feasibility study. Given the significant changes to the Route 1 corridor and security policies implemented after 1997, a new PHT alignment and program at Fort Belvoir should be identified to eliminate the gap. The current pedestrian pathways and sidewalks along Route 1 do not provide scenic quality since they constrain trail users to walk 5 to 8 feet from the roadside. Therefore, a new trail alignment needs to be identified that provides an exceptional user experience that is consistent with the nation's scenic trails. Closing the trail gap should meet the goals of federal, state, and local policies, as well as current legislative guidance for evaluating the alignment options. In addition, this planning work presents the potential for Fort Belvoir to make connections among the area's cultural and natural resources, form partnerships with neighboring organizations, enhance regional and local land and water trails, and expand upon existing trail programs. From the fall of 2015 to the fall of 2016, NCPC engaged more than 20 government and trail stakeholder representatives. The potential PHT alignments in the feasibility study are based on these consultations with stakeholders obtained through group interviews, meetings, and outdoor hikes on site. The PHT options include 1 trail option along the US Route 1 corridor and 2 program options, a seasonal guided interpretive event, and land and water trail tours. While each option could stand alone as a potential solution to eliminating the PHT gap, options 2 and 3 are intended to be potential supplements to option 1. Option 1, shown in pink, consists of the Route 1 multi-purpose trail and sidewalk with the addition of natural surface trails just off the Route 1 corridor. The additional natural surface trails would be hiker only and would be self-directed access. The trails would be open at all times of day and throughout the year. The additional trails use edge landscapes between the roadside and security fences or natural barriers in order to remove trail users further from the roadway and to create a more scenic trail experience. The trail alignment brings hikers 5 feet to up to 400 feet away from the roadway edge. However, the majority of the trail is adjacent to the roadside, with hikers separated only 5 to 8 feet from traffic. This section shows the typical 10-foot wide multi-purpose trail on the north side of Route 1. The natural surface trail would occur between Route 1 and a fence or geographic feature such as a creek or dense vegetation. And here is an example of what that area looks like in dense forest cover just south of Davison Army Airfield. This section shows the south side of Route 1 and the 5-foot sidewalk and natural surface trail. In all cases, a management agreement between the Army and another governmental entity would be required for the additional easement area and trail management. Future perimeter security fence locations would also need to be coordinated with this trail alignment. As previously mentioned, a trail user would experience a limited setback from the roadway of only 5 to 8 feet for the majority of the trail, approximately 2.5 miles of the 5-mile segment shown here in red. Limited potential for north-south connectivity across Route 1 further constrains pedestrians since there are only 7 intersections with crosswalks and the average distance between them is over 1/2 mile. So this photo illustrates the trail condition on the north side of Route 1 next to 3 lanes of traffic. And this photo illustrates the south side of Route 1. So in conclusion, option 1 is feasible. However, option 1 limits opportunities for off-road trail experiences. Therefore, it is recommended that additional programs such as events and tours be explored to enhance the PHT at Fort Belvoir, and these are suggested as options 2 and 3. Option 2 consists of a seasonal guided interpretive event. The proposed event route, shown in blue, is 7 miles long and would be accessible to hikers and bikers on designated occasions held 3 to 4 times a year. Potential events to showcase the trail include Veterans Day, Memorial Day, National Trails Day, and the Christmas Bird Count. The guided educational and experiential events are a means to understand the layers of history and the natural and cultural resources at Fort Belvoir. It is important to note that a hiking guide would be critical for this option since a portion of the route traverses active range and training areas. Option 2 offers the most immersive experience of the Accotink Bay Wildlife Refuge, one of the largest and most remote wooded areas remaining in Fairfax County. This alignment is co-located with existing public access trails, paved roads, and abandoned roads. Therefore, no new trails would be created. I should also note that as part of this feasibility study, NCPC completed case study research to investigate how 5 other U.S. military installations address public recreational access on active training areas. Eglin Air Force Base, located on the western panhandle of Florida and shown in the map to the left, provides the best example of how the military has managed risk exposure and protected public safety. For example, Eglin requires trail users to sign a hold harmless user agreement and watch a safety video before purchasing a hiking permit. And Eglin uses signs to warn hikers of dangers off the trail and tools such as iSportsman to communicate area access closures to the public on a daily basis. Since the option 2 event route traverses active range and training areas, Fort Belvoir would need to seriously consider certain safety precautions in order to mitigate risks. Public access and exposure to unexploded ordnance, training and hunting areas could be managed similarly to how other military installations like Eglin have managed these risks. For instance, the hiking event would likely need to be guided by military personnel, registration with a valid ID would be required, and users would need to comply with spontaneous area closures due to military activities. Users would also likely need to undergo safety training and submit an indemnity waiver. In conclusion, option 2 is a possible supplement to option 1. This option affords trail users the opportunity for an experience that is the most immersive in nature and history. Hikers have the opportunity to experience a diverse array of vegetation, from forest woodland to grassland, as well as riparian and marsh shoreline along Accotink and Pohick Bays. And lastly, we have option 3, which consists of a land and water trail tour. This proposed event route, shown in yellow, varies in length with 2 miles by land and variable water lengths, and would be accessible by hikers and boaters during day and supplemented on occasion with outfitted guided tours. This option uses existing publicly accessible trails on Fort Belvoir and suggests an additional water trail connection between Fort Belvoir's Environmental Education Center boat launch and the Pohick Bay Regional Park boat launch. Belvoir's trails are currently open to the public. These photos show the existing Belvoir trailheads. However, all water tour participants would likely need to register using a valid ID with Fort Belvoir prior to accessing the boat launch. Outfitted tours would likely be led by military personnel or a partnering group with no night or overnight use. Option 3, a multimodal connection, was suggested by the National Park Service Chesapeake Bay office to better connect the Captain John Smith and Star Spangled Banner water trails to public lands. The National Park Service recently completed the Potomac River Segment Plan, focusing on a 140-mile stretch of the Potomac River from Great Falls to the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. Development of additional water access points helps meet the goals of the plan to provide 300 new access points by 2020. NPS is well positioned to collaborate with other site managers, such as Fort Belvoir, Pohick Bay Regional Park, and sites on Mason Neck. In conclusion, option 3 is a possible supplement to option 1 and/or 2. This option utilizes existing public access trails with additional modifications focused on water-land connections and provision for public access onto the base. Guided and outfitted programs could supplement the designation of the PHT network and could better connect Fort Belvoir to Pohick Bay Regional Park and surrounding destinations accessible via the Potomac. As an overview, option 1 provides additional off-road segments with marginal scenic value since the majority is adjacent to the Route 1 corridor. Option 2 provides the most scenic experience of the Potomac and the Accotink Bay Wildlife Refuge, though public exposure to military training and hunting areas would need to be managed. Option 3 creates a new land-to-water trail connection from existing public hiking trails and offers the potential for the Army to partner with local guided outfitters. So at this time, NCPC concludes that in order to address the legislation for and opportunities associated with the PHT within the study area, option 1 should be implemented and additional discussion and consideration for options 2 and 3 should continue in order to refine the requirements and processes needed for implementation. Following the feasibility study review by Fort Belvoir's commanders, a determination will be made on the most feasible trail alignment and/or combination of options for eliminating the PHT gap within the study area. This planning effort will inform future trail planning and any future NEPA requirements, and a finalized PHT alignment will be incorporated within Fort Belvoir's next master plan update. Per the terms of the MOU, the parties have agreed to consider supplementary agreements when deemed necessary to support planning and development of the trail. And ultimately, a governmental entity could be responsible for constructing, maintaining, and/or managing the programming for future trail segments. So just as a reminder, this is simply an information presentation, so I would welcome any comments or suggestions that you have on the feasibility study and its conclusions. That completes my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions, and we also have Chris Landgraf here from the Army as well.
Thank you, Ms. Spiegel, very much. Mr. Rhodes, welcome.
Like to show up before it ends.
We have been enveloped by your spirit the whole time. Mr. Rhodes, do you have any particular comments on this item?
No particular comments. Did appreciate the very thorough work by staff and the conclusions that they came to. And certainly if we have any questions for the folks from Fort Belvoir, it'd be, they're here for it.
Yep, Mr. Landgraf is here as well. Questions or comments from commission members for the presentation? Mr. May.
Thank you very much, Ms. Spiegel. First of all, I would like to thank NCPC, Megan Spiegel, and everyone that she works with here on staff on this feasibility study. Thank the Army and Chris Landgraf. I understand the work they've done together has been an extraordinary effort, and of course, the Northern Virginia Regional Commission. We really view this as a vitally important component of our work. It's not quite as visible as many of the actual parcels of land that we manage, but National Park Service across the country does manage a number of regional trails, and they are as important to our mission in many ways as the vital lands and monuments that we manage on behalf of the American people. Just to reinforce what's happening with Potomac Heritage Trail, it is nationally significant. It tells the story of the life and exploration of George Washington and the westward expansion, the western development of our westward development of our nation, which in itself is an extraordinary story. I can't remember the name of the book that I read not too long ago about George Washington and his efforts to move westward and move up the Potomac and all that. I mean, it really was a great story. Anyway, we view this as a significant gap in the trail, and being able to eliminate this trail gap amidst this wealth of important heritage resources like Mount Vernon Woodlawn and even the Army Museum, I think it's vitally important. And we also think that it provides Fort Belvoir with an opportunity to tell its own story about military history and its ties to the Washington and its tie-in with the Washington-Rochambeau route. So it's more than just about the Park Service; it's about the Army and their history. Option one, obviously, is the most feasible and provides something more than simply a sidewalk along a maybe not so also pleasant stretch of road, but what stretches of roads are really that great, except maybe a few parkways that we have. But anyway, options 2 and 3 would directly benefit the Potomac Heritage Trail and position the trail closer to the Potomac River and provide a much more worthwhile hiking and trail experience. And we view those as perhaps not as much as we would like to have happen, but certainly more than we have now. And I think when I say we, I mean all of us. I don't mean just the National Park Service. I would also say that the case study research on Eglin Air Force Base is quite instructional and provides a good example of what may be possible as we try to provide access to these natural resources that are, again, owned by the American people, but also make sure that the Army can manage the risk and ensure the safety of the public. So moving forward, we encourage Fort Belvoir to take full advantage of their resources and work with adjacent landowners to realize the potential of a fully completed and connected Potomac Heritage Trail in this location, and continue considering the possibility of implementing options 2 and 3 as a means to do this, perhaps maybe as an initial means as we try to push for even more. But again, we understand all of the constraints that Fort Belvoir is operating under, and we're not looking to push beyond what is safe, but make sure that we take the maximum advantage for the benefit of all of us. So thank you very much. Thank you.
One quick question. Is the boat launch at the mouth of Accotink Bay, is that existing?
It is existing.
Other thoughts or questions? Yes, Mr. Gauss.
Thank you. Thanks for the great presentation. And, you know, the unexploded ordnance did get my attention in terms of making this something that, but I know the Army has to sort of announce that as something that is a possibility. But I hope that in taking this study seriously, that the Army would really look a little more closely at whether that is a risk or not, as opposed to sort of a general statement, which most Army installations have to consider. But the hope would be that that risk would be, if not totally eliminated, minimized as a way to make this a real viable option for the trail connection. So look forward to hearing how you manage and navigate through that. Thank you.
Speak a little bit to that now. I mean, the Army has a
If you want to identify yourself just for the record.
Sorry, Chris Landgraf. I'm the Deputy Director of Public Works at Fort Belvoir, previously the master planner when this whole process started. My new master planner is here, Dan O'Brien, so you won't have to see my face anymore, which is probably a benefit to y'all. We are actually part of the reason for this ongoing process, and part of our, the reason for the MOU is that concurrently with all of this, we are going through a range identification, management, and, cleanup process. And so we are trying to, we've done the whole history, the maps that Megan showed you, kind of identify exactly where we have identified the ranges historically. One of the reasons for the markers and everything still is that even though we have done surface clearing to the maximum extent practicable since the engineer school actually left, and most of our active explosives training left with it, the reality is that we do have range areas that were used from the late or mid 1940s until the late to mid 1970s. And so that's a considerable amount of time, and if anybody has ever fired any kind of ballistic device, they know that it doesn't always hit the target you anticipate. And so that's our concern, and obviously that's our reason for the guidance. And so, but we have, and we've explained this to Megan in the past, I mean, the majority of the areas that we use, especially for roads and things like that, we have done surface clearing on. But the concern is that, surface clearing is still only to a certain depth, and you may have a rain event that actually exposes something where a creek crosses, and those would be the concerns because these areas do cross creeks and drainages, as Megan showed in the planning. So that's one of the reasons why, how we go through with this and how we manage this in the future becomes one of those questions, and especially the fiscal concerns that the Army has for, how we manage things like this that may impact our other fiscal opportunities and options that we have to deal with. So,
Follow up for that. For the residents of Fort Belvoir, who do they have ability to use these trails now pretty openly, or are they also restricted?
well, they don't use the lower portion that Megan showed that cuts across the UXO area. They use the McCarty Loop Trail portion, which is the area that is contained within the Accotank Bay Wildlife Refuge. The refuge, when established in the 1988 BRAC, was significantly surface cleared and, swept, magnetically and things like that to try to reduce any kind of impact. We do provide our residents on, briefings that, what to look for. We do also, all residents are advised that if you see something, pointed out, don't touch it type of deal, which are the same briefings that Megan was saying that we would have to give to the others. The folks who do access the area mostly are hunters, and then the folks who are in, military folks who are out there using it as a land nav or a true training area, they are given full UXO training and full UXO, identification and a list of potential devices that we have used in the history that we know of that they could potentially identify. That would be also part of the training requirement for folks who are going to even be on the guided tour, just to make sure. Because, even to the extent of using this in the idea of having like family hikes or guided hikes and family being on them, our concern is always that, that to clean things to a residential standard takes them to a much higher, much more costly event schedule than to clean things to just an industrial standard. But when you start to put families who aren't associated with the military and specifically their children out into areas that, if they stray from the trail, they may have a problem, that's where we get, a moment of pause and a moment of concern, obviously. So that's one of the reasons that we're continuing to work through these processes with NCPC.
Well, it would really be wonderful if we could figure it out, because Fort Belvoir is such a beautiful natural resource in some of these areas. I agree with other commissioner Peter May, who indicates this, I think, could be a very valuable connection to a bigger trail system. So I look forward to that happening.
We don't disagree. We just, Got to mitigate the risk.
Yes,
and that's-
thank you.
That's part of our goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Landgraf. Further discussion? Hearing none, thank you very much. We've had a very good afternoon and have cleared a number of substantial projects before us. So thank you, and with that, we are adjourned.